detail, while for others we'll be covering the very basic. Till now, what we have done is that financial management or finance function of the firm is the sum total of effective raising and effective utilization of funds. So a firm will look at various options before deciding the sources of finance it will be using, or the sources it will be availing. Debt equity are the two broad sources of funds or finance for the firm, but then within them we have a number of bifurcations. Funds are required at different stages of the life cycle or the operation of the firm. So, in the initial stages, you require loads of funds for investment, say for purchasing machine, infrastructure, building, and so on. Whereas once you are operating, you also require funds for your working capital requirements, that is, day to day expenditure of the firm. So, accordingly, we categorize various sources of funds. Let's quickly move on to the sources of funds based on the time period. So, time period, that is the time or duration for which you require the funds. Now, on this basis, you can have long term sources of finance and short term sources of finance. Under long term sources of finance, we have equity shares, preference shares, debenture, and fixed deposits. Now, these long-term sources of finance provide a large amount of money to the firm, and they can be used for a period more than 1 year. And in some cases, depending on the time period for the issue specified, they are used for a period of more than 5 years. In finance, say that short term is less than 1 year. Then after this comes the long term sources for a period more than 1 year. And sometimes 1 to 5 years is taken as medium term source of finance, and then long term is taken as some time period which is more than 5 years. So depending on the bifurcation, short term is always less than 1 year, and then 1 to 5 year can be taken as medium term, and in those cases we take long term as more than 5 years. Let's discuss each of these sources one by one. Um, I'll come to the short term sources. Okay, so let's first have a look at the classification and I'll take up each of these sources. Now, short term, as clearly specified, is for a period less than 1 year. Long term, let's count for the timing as more than 1 year. So, under short term sources of finance, you have these sources. We'll be covering each of them in detail. Bank giving you some credit, any advance from the customer, trade credit, factoring, public deposit, money market instruments. After that, on the basis of ownership, you have equity and you have debt, which is borrowed capital. On basis of sources of generation, so whether you are able to raise the funds internally or you need some external help with raising of funds, that makes the classification on basis of generation, source of generation. So let's start with equity shares. So equity shares are part of ownership capital of the firm. They are long-term sources of finance for the fund, and it is an external source of fund generation. Now, If I go for literal definition of equity shares are those shares which are other than preference shares of the company. So these are ordinary shares and not the preference shares of the company. As already introduced in the previous classes, equity shareholders are the real owners of the company. They have voting rights attached to the shares they purchase. Then they also have a control on the management of the company because equity shareholders appoint the board of directors of the company. So day-to-day management of the company is done by the board of directors who are the elected representatives of the equity shareholders. The equity shareholders they get return in form of dividend and they have right to surplus dividend, surplus earnings of the company. इसका मतलब क्या है कि जब कंपनी के पास अर्निंग्स आई, जब प्रॉफिट आया, तो उसमें सबसे पहले क्लेम बनता है डेट कॉन्ट्रीब्यूटर्स का, डिवेंचर होल्डर्स का। उसके बाद प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स का क्लेम बनता है और लास्ट में जो क्लेम आता है वो इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स का आता है। तो अगर कंपनी के पास सरप्लस अर्निंग्स है तो उन पर भी किसका राइट बनता है, उन पे इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स का राइट बनता है बिकॉज फॉर डेट एंड प्रेफरेंस शेयर द रिटर्न इज फिक्स्ड फॉर debt in the form of interest, and for preference shareholders preference dividend is fixed. So it is the equity shareholders who have right to surplus earnings of the company. Now equity shares cannot be redeemed during the lifetime of the company. रिडीम्ड इन द सेंस कि कंपनी रिटर्न नहीं करती इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स को उनका क्लेम्स एज लॉन्ग एज द कंपनी इज एग्जिस्टिंग. So only at the time of winding up of the company that all claims are settled. But yes, during the lifetime of the company can go for buyback of the shares. So this is not redemption, but this is subsequent purchase of the shares from the public. Has anyone heard of the term buyback? Because if I talk about today, then buyback is back into news because of which company has offered buyback of shares? Anyone following the news, the market? A big IT company has offered buyback of shares to its shareholders. वेरी गुड तन्मय. टीसीएस कितने पे ऑफर कर रहा है बायबैक? नो आइडिया. So TCS has offered to the existing shareholders that they can return their shares back to the company at rupees 4,500 per share. 4,500 है, 4,000 नहीं है, 4,500 है. Also, buyback of shares is say when the company wants to take control back from the uh, शेयर होल्डर्स या पब्लिक एट लार्ज से वो चाहती है कि वापस जो डिसीजन मेकिंग अथॉरिटी है या कंसंट्रेशन है वो वापस प्रमोटर्स के पास आ जाए. तो इसलिए बायबैक की ऑप्शन दी जाती है. नाउ से द कंपनी हैज सरप्लस कैश and they feel that they want to take back the control, they can give the option of buyback. Again, this is an option. Say I have TCS shares today, I can decline this offer also. So I'm not interested in returning back the shares of the company. But otherwise, equity shares are for infinite period as long as the company exists. The equity shares will also exist. Equity shareholders are the last ones to get return from the company and again the last one to get their claims settled at the time of winding up of the company. So, coming to the features, as already discussed, there's no maturity time, no maturity period for equity shares. They have a residual claim on the income, last claim on the income of the company if income remains by that time. Then they have residual claim on the assets of the company. So again, after settling the claims of debt holders, preference shareholders, if anything remains, then that is passed on to the equity shareholders. But then why do people purchase equity shares? Because they get the right to control the company. Then they also get a right on the surplus earnings of the company. They also have preemptive right. प्रीएम्प्टिव राइट क्या होता है कि जब एक कंपनी फर्दर इशू ऑफ शेयर्स लाती है देन the first opportunity to purchase these shares is given to the existing shareholders. So this is known as rights issue. तो जब कंपनी को एडिशनल फंड्स रिक्वायर्ड हैं उसमें और शेयर्स इशू करने हैं तो पब्लिक के पास जाने से पहले they prefer going to the existing shareholders because that will again reduce more outside interference. At least जो shareholding pattern है वो maintain रहेगा. Again, this is an option for the equity shareholder. If I'm not interested in purchasing more shares of the company, I can decline this right. So after that, limited liability. लिमिटेड लाइबिलिटी मीन्स कि जो मेरे शेयर्स हैं और शेयर्स पर अगर कोई अमाउंट अनपेड है सिर्फ उतना ही उधार मेरा कंपनी की तरफ है उसके अलावा माय पर्सनल एसेट्स आर सेपरेट for me till the time I pay the amount on shares there is some liability otherwise there is no liability towards the company. So once the shares are fully paid up there is no liability. For example, hypothetical example है if the shareholder purchased 100 shares with a face value of rupees 10 and he has paid only 900 then the only outstanding liability is 100. Now with everything being very transparent and you operating through your demat accounts, trading account, everything online without total payment of funds you are not allotted shares in your demat account. तो प्रैक्टिकली इसकी एप्लीकेशन कम है बट हाँ फॉर नॉलेज पर्पसेस फॉर लीगल पर्पसेस द लाइबिलिटी इज लिमिटेड टू any unpaid amount on shares. Otherwise, as a shareholder, I have no liability towards the company. Advantages of equity shares to the company the advantage is that it is a permanent source of finance. To the shareholder the advantage is that there is a voting right attached to it. To the company the advantage is there are no fixed dividends. तो कंपनी के लिए कहीं पर भी ये लाइबिलिटी नहीं है कि हर ईयर डिविडेंड पे करना ही करना है टू इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स. कंपनी के लिए डेट होल्डर्स के टुवर्ड्स लाइबिलिटी होती है कि हर ईयर इंटरेस्ट पे करना है and towards preference shareholders there is a liability that every year preference dividend has to be paid. There is no such liability in equity shares. Now next is retained earnings. If equity shareholders are not given dividend their money is retained back by the firm, which can then be used for future investment opportunities. Disadvantages of equity shares. So, during the lifetime of the company, I'm not getting back the money. Equity shareholders sometimes जो majority holding ले लेते हैं they can interfere in the management of the company. There is a lot of speculation in equity shares. What is speculation? What is speculation? Very popular term. No one has heard of this term, speculation.
I'm basically predicting gain or loss as per the current market trends.
Okay, so yes, absolutely right. Speculation is playing on price changes. तो आप शेयर्स आप एक्सपेक्ट करा आपने कि कल इस कंपनी का शेयर इंक्रीज हो जाएगा, आज आपने खरीदा शेयर, कल उसको एग्जिट कर दिया, उसको सेल कर दिया. So you're not investing for a long time period. You are just taking a chance and you are playing on the price changes in the market. Or after 2 hours, I expect that okay, there is an announcement related to the annual result of a company. और ये एक्सपेक्टेशन है कि कंपनी ने अपना प्रॉफिट अप टू द मार्क अचीव नहीं करा या जो एक्सपेक्टेड प्रॉफिट था वो अर्न नहीं करा, तो आप शेयर को अभी सेल करना शुरू कर दोगे ताकि बाद में वो शेयर का जब प्राइस गिरे तो आपको लॉस ना हो, या आपने अभी सेल किया बाद में परचेज करा, शॉर्ट सेलिंग करी, तो दे आर डिफरेंट स्ट्रैटेजीज व्हिच कैन बी यूज्ड विदाउट गोइंग इनटू द डिटेल. Speculation is short term trading strategy wherein we try to make profit by through the price changes or price fluctuations in the market. तो लॉन्ग टर्म जब आप पैसा लगाते हो वो इन्वेस्टमेंट होती है, बहुत शॉर्ट टाइम पीरियड के लिए सिर्फ प्रॉफिट अर्न करने के लिए जो आप कर रहे हो वो स्पेक्यूलेशन है. और इक्विटी शेयर्स में देयर इज अ लॉट ऑफ स्पेक्यूलेशन. Okay. Then limited income to the investor in the sense there is no surety of income here. If I want to keep a regular flow of income, I should prefer debt or preference shares. Coming to the next categorization, which is preference shares. So preference shares, as the name suggests, they are given preference, and this preference is given over the equity shares. Now, why do we use the term preference? Because they get preference at the time of distribution of income, and they also get preference at the time of winding up of the company. Their liabilities are settled first. There are different types of preference shares, but ओवरऑल प्रेफरेंस शेयर्स के साथ वोटिंग राइट्स अटैच्ड नहीं होती, वो राइट सिर्फ इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स के पास होती है. देन इफ आई टॉक अबाउट द टाइप ऑफ प्रेफरेंस शेयर्स, क्यूमुलेटिव, नॉन क्यूमुलेटिव. क्यूमुलेटिव होता है जिसमें एडिंग अप होती है. So this means cumulative preference shares may, if a company is not having profit in a particular year and it cannot pay preference dividend, then this is adding up, or this type of equity share, sorry, preference share will add up this dividend, and this dividend will be paid next time when the firm has profit. Together, this year's dividend and last year's dividend will be paid. So any unpaid dividend is added up and repaid, or is paid when the firm earns surplus profits. If the preference share does not have this feature attached, it is a non-cumulative preference share. Next. ओके, नेक्स्ट इज रिडीमेबल प्रेफरेंस शेयर. रिडीमेबल, अगर एक प्रेफरेंस शेयर के साथ फिक्स्ड मेच्योरिटी पीरियड इज अटैच्ड, so say 10 years preference shares are issued, so 10 years, 10% preference shares, rupees 100 each. This means that every preference share will give a dividend of rupees 10 a year, and this cash flow or this dividend would continue for 10 years. After that, the preference shareholder will be returned back this 100 rupees. Redemption का मतलब होता है जो आपके shares की face value है, अगर until and unless any other value is specified, this amount will be returned back. After that, irredeemable preference shares, those where there's no fixed time period. Participating preference shares, additional facility होती है that after dividend has been distributed to equity shareholders, they can get extra profits or extra dividend from the company. तो एक बारी ये 10 रुपए मिल गया, इस साल में कंपनी के पास बहुत अच्छे प्रॉफिट्स अर्न हुए, इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स को भी डिविडेंड मिल गया, उसके बाद दे कैन गेट एडिशनल मनी फ्रॉम द कंपनी और एडिशनल रिटर्न फ्रॉम द कंपनी. All the terms and conditions are specified at the time of issue of this category of preference shares. बट नॉन पार्टिसिपेटिंग कौन से होंगे? जिनके पास कोई भी एडिशनल क्लेम नहीं है ओवर द एक्स्ट्रा प्रॉफिट्स ऑफ द कंपनी. Next, coming to the features of preference shares. So there is no fixed maturity again except for redeemable preference shares. They have claim over the assets and income of the company before the equity shareholders. They do not have any voting rights, but fixed dividend makes this as a more secure kind of investment as compared to equity shares. एंड डिपेंडिंग अगर क्यूमुलेटिव डिविडेंड्स हैं तो चाहे लॉस हो, आपकी इनकम अश्योर्ड है. नेक्स्ट जब भी कंपनी प्रॉफिट अर्न करेगी, आपको लास्ट ईयर का डिविडेंड भी मिल जाएगा. If you have redeemable preference shares, then they will be redeemed after some time. Participating preference shares will give you the right to extra income of the company. But then preference share is an expensive source of finance when compared to equity shares. There are no voting rights attached. For company, it is a permanent burden, क्योंकि हर ईयर आपकी एक लाइबिलिटी पहले ही एक एक्सपेंडिचर इज देयर. देन फॉर preference shareholders, you have fixed dividend only. So even if the company of which you have purchased the preference shares is performing extremely well, you cannot get extra income until and unless you have participating preference shares. The third source of finance, the third long-term source of finance, which is part of the debt capital of the firm, is debenture. Now, debenture is a simple IOU document issued by the company. IOU, company is not approaching a bank for a loan, it is approaching general public for loan, and acknowledgement of this loan is in form of the debentures which are issued by the company. Company will pay interest on the debentures. So again, 10% debentures, rupees 100. So every year the interest of rupees 10 has to be paid on the debenture per year. Now, debentures can be of different types. Unsecured, secured debentures. Secured debentures क्या होते हैं? Which are issued against the security of assets of the company. इसका मतलब आपने उधार दिया है कंपनी को, जैसे आप लोन लेने जाते हैं, तो इफ यू आर टेकिंग say a business loan, you will give the security of your say हाउस, रेसिडेंशियल प्रॉपर्टी की सिक्योरिटी दे रहे हो या कोई और एसेट की सिक्योरिटी दे रहे हो. स्टूडेंट लोन जनरली अनसिक्योर्ड होता है, बट इसके अलावा आप कोई भी लोन ले रहे हो तो उसके अगेंस्ट आपको कुछ सिक्योरिटी देनी पड़ती है, जिसको हम collateral भी बोलते हैं. If you fail to repay back the loan, this collateral is seized, is taken by the is seized by the bank. तो उसी तरह जब डिबेंचर्स इशू हो रहे हैं, अगर उनके बिहाइंड कुछ एसेट्स हैं एज सिक्योरिटी, दे आर सिक्योर्ड डिबेंचर्स, otherwise they are known as unsecured debentures. Obviously secured debentures are better than unsecured debentures, इसीलिए जो इंटरेस्ट रेट होगा वो अनसिक्योर्ड डिबेंचर्स पर ज्यादा होगा एज कंपेयर टू सिक्योर्ड डिबेंचर्स. तो लेट्स टेक secured debentures have 10% rate of interest, unsecured will have 11% rate of interest. Can anyone tell me why? अगर एक कंपनी सिक्योर्ड डिबेंचर्स इशू कर रही है, वो आपको 10% पे इशू कर रही है डिबेंचर्स, पर एक कंपनी जो अनसिक्योर्ड डिबेंचर्स इशू कर रही है वो आपको 11% रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट ऑफर कर रही है. ऐसा क्यों होगा?
Ma'am, because even the company secured, and on the other hand, secured debentures में at least there's a collateral, so the company knows that अगर कुछ हो भी जाए तो वो recover कर सकती है पैसे.
कंपनी तो रिकवर नहीं कर रही ना, तेरा कंपनी ने तो उधार लिया है. रिकवर कौन करेगा? डेट होल्डर रिकवर करेगा, जो डिबेंचर होल्डर है. अगर कंपनी फेल होती है तो किसको पैसा मिलना चाहिए? कंपनी को थोड़ा ना मिलेगा, तब तो डिबेंचर होल्डर
Debt
को मिलना
holder.
चाहिए.
Yes.
हाँ, डेट होल्डर को मिलना चाहिए. तो यस, partially correct. Yes, anyone else wants to add? Someone raise the hand.
Yes, from similar response. Basically, the company insecure debentures company does have some assets for which they can have debt, and therefore they are not providing that higher rate of interest. Whereas in unsecured, they do not have any basically security. They do not have any commitment prior to it. That is why they are compensating it with giving more interest with more money.
Yes. So there is a rule in finance: higher risk, higher return. So if I am taking more risk, I am expecting more return. तो अगर एक कंपनी के पास सिक्योरिटी नहीं है देने को, तो मैं ज्यादा रिस्क ले रही हूँ बाय परचेजिंग द डिबेंचर्स ऑफ दैट कंपनी, सो आई एक्सपेक्ट हायर रिटर्न. तो इसी तरह अगर आप बैंक से लोन नहीं ले पा रहे, आपके क्रेडेंशियल अच्छे नहीं हैं, तो जहां भी बाहर आप लोन लेने जाओगे वो बैंक से ज्यादा रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट पे ही आपको लोन देंगे. जो भी मनी लेंडर के पास आप जाओगे, डिपेंडिंग ऑन योर बैकग्राउंड एंड क्रेडिट हिस्ट्री, जो भी आपका फाइनेंशियल बैकग्राउंड है, जहां पर ज्यादा रिस्क है वहां पर ज्यादा रिटर्न भी देना पड़ेगा. So this same is the case for a company also. Then redeemable debentures again कुछ time period के बाद redeem हो जाएंगे. Irredeemable debentures are which are there with the company for the lifetime of the company. Convertible debentures which can be converted into equity shares after a point of time. So at the time of issue of debentures, these are it is specified that these are convertible debentures which can be converted into shares after 10 years. तो उसके बाद 10 years के एंड पे कंपनी आपको ऑप्शन देगी whether you want to convert your debentures into equity shares, और कितना प्राइस आपको पे करना पड़ेगा for those equity shares. This is again an option which is given. If you want, you can go ahead, otherwise you can decline the option also. So features of debentures generally have a time period, maturity period, first claim in the income of the company, first claim on the asset of the company, but no voting rights. फिक्स्ड रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट। तो फीचर से ही आपको एडवांटेजेस और डिसएडवांटेजेस मिल जाते हैं। Biggest advantage for the company is that interest that is paid on debentures is tax deductible। तो जो भी earnings होती हैं, earnings before interest and taxes, पहले interest minus होता है, profit before tax आता है, उसके बाद tax minus हो रहा है। तो जो इंटरेस्ट है उसकी वजह से टैक्स लायबिलिटी कंपनी की कम हो जाती है। दैट इज द बिगेस्ट एडवांटेज ऑफ डेट कैपिटल फॉर द कंपनी। बट फिक्स्ड लायबिलिटी है, अगर कंपनी इंटरेस्ट पे नहीं करती, डेट होल्डर्स, डिबेंचर होल्डर्स कैन टेक कंपनी टू द कोर्ट and the court can order the winding up of the company also. So, if the company is unable to earn profit, even then it has to pay fixed rate of interest to the debenture holder. If it is not doing so, then the company can be taken to court and court can order the closing down of the company as well. That is why debentures should be issued very carefully after being very sure of the earnings capacity of your business. Only then debentures should be issued.